I am not a thing to be sold. Shima said it to the dirt of an auction yard, and that one line would change everything. Because by morning, she would be standing at a stranger's gate in a New Mexico Territory border town, autumn of 1886, choosing him of her own free will the way no bill of sale ever could. Jeremiah Stone had dragged her 3 days south from the Chiricahua foothills with her wrist rope burned and her chin still up, meaning to sell her like stock to the highest man on that platform, a young rancher who rode into town that morning for nothing more than fence wire and salt, would put down every dollar he had, tear the paper in front of the whole crowd, and tell her she owed him nothing at all, and what happened after that tore up everything. Both of them thought they knew about debt and about want and about the difference between the two. This is the story of Shima and Beau Calder, of a ranch gate before dawn, and of a name finally spoken out loud after months of silence. Stay to the end for that name, and if these stories are the kind you come back for, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member. Now let's go back to the auction yard to the morning it started. Jeremiah Stone's yard sat behind the mercantile on the ragged east edge of town, where the buildings gave up trying to look respectable, and the dirt road just trailed off into scrub. He'd built a platform out of scavenged lumber, waist high, with nail heads working loose from the wood the way they do after a few seasons of weather, and men leaned on the rail with their hats pushed back and their breath fogging in the cool morning air. Stone had a voice, built for carrying, the kind that could talk a crowd into believing whatever he needed them to believe for as long as it took him to close a deal, and he used it now, walking the platform edge, gesturing at the woman standing at its center like she was a good mule he was proud of. Shima did not look at him. She kept her spine straight and her chin level and her eyes fixed, somewhere past the crowd, past the buildings, past the whole ugly morning, toward the mountains she could not see from here but knew were there. Her deerskin dress was torn at one shoulder, where a length of rope had rubbed it raw, and her braid had come half loose, but she had not let herself cry in front of these men not once in 3 days, and she was not going to start now. She was Chiricahua, and her grandmother's mother had survived worse than a rope and a platform, and she intended to survive this, too, on her own terms, with her back straight the whole way through it. Stone had found her band's winter camp broken and scattered after an army sweep through the foothills, its people run in every direction with nothing but what they carried, and he had a particular talent for finding people in exactly that condition, alone, displaced, with no one left close enough to come looking. He called what he did trading. He told himself a story where he was simply moving goods that would otherwise go to waste, where the people he took were headed for hardship regardless, and he was only smoothing the road. It let him sleep. It let him stand on this platform now with his thumbs in his vest pockets and talk about her strong hands and her quick mind like he was listing a horse's gaits, and it let him not hear, or pretend not to hear, the thing she'd said to the dirt a moment before the bidding opened. I am not a thing to be sold, and I will not lower my eyes for men who cannot look me in mine. Stone heard it. He smiled the smile of a man who found defiance entertaining in something he already considered handled, and raised his voice to open the bidding. The 3 days it had taken Stone to drag her south from the foothills had taught Shima a great deal about the particular cowardice of men who needed rope to feel powerful. He had kept her wrists bound at night and loose enough by day that she could walk without stumbling and slowing his progress, a small mercy that cost him nothing and that he mentioned twice as though it made him generous. She had not eaten most of what he offered, not from pride exactly, but because taking food from a man's hand while he called you cargo felt like agreeing with him, and she would not agree with him, not with her body and not with her voice. Not once across those 3 days. At night, staked near his fire with the other 2 captives he'd gathered from a different scattered camp, an older man who did not speak at all, and a boy of perhaps 14 who cried without sound, so Stone would not hear it. She had kept her eyes on the stars. Her grandmother had taught her to read. the same stars that had watched over that mountain range for longer than any territory had existed, and told herself that the ground under her, wherever Stone marched her across it, still belonged to people like her, whether the paper in his saddlebag said so or not. She did not know on that third morning, walking into the border town with the platform already half built behind the mercantile, that a rancher 3 miles out was saddling a horse for a trip to buy fence wire, thinking of nothing more significant than hinges and salt blocks. She knew only that she intended to survive whatever came next with her name and her spine intact, and that intention, more than any hope of rescue, was the only thing keeping her upright as Stone led her toward the platform and the gathering crowd. Beau Calder had ridden into town before sunup with a wagon list in his coat pocket, fence wire, salt blocks, a new set of hinges for the barn door that had been dragging on packed dirt for 2 winters running, and full intentions of being back at his own gate by early afternoon. He was 31 years old, unmarried, with a face that still had most of its softness left in it, and hands that had only lately started to earn the calluses of a man running a spread alone. He'd inherited the place from an uncle 3 years back, 400 head of scrub cattle in a house that needed work, and a debt at the territorial bank that kept him up some nights doing arithmetic in his head. He was not a hard man. He had not yet had the years to make him one, and there were mornings he wondered if he ever would. Working land this unforgiving with nobody beside him to share the weight of it. He heard Stone's voice before he saw the platform, that particular carrying cadence men use when they're selling something they don't want, examined too closely, and something in his gut went tight and cold before his mind had caught up to why. He tied his horse at the mercantile rail out of habit, not decision, and walked toward the sound, the way a man walks toward a sound he already half dreads recognizing. When he came around the corner and saw the platform, and the woman standing on it with her chin up and her wrists rope-scarred, something in him that had been quiet his whole adult life sat up hard and would not lie back down. He was not a man who went looking for causes. He minded his own fence line, paid his taxes, kept his opinions to himself in town, because opinions cost a man business he could not afford to lose. But there was a look on her face. Not fear, though fear was surely under it somewhere, but a flat, held-together refusal to let this crowd see her break. That reached something in Beau he didn't have words for yet. He thought of his mother, dead 8 years now, who used to say a person's worth never once depended on what somebody else was willing to pay for them. He thought of nothing at all, actually, by the time his hand went up and his voice cut across Stone's practice patter with a number that made the whole yard go quiet. He was aware, distantly, of the men around him turning to look, some amused, a few outright disapproving. One older rancher he recognized from the feed store muttering something about a young fool wasting good money on a notion. Beau did not look at any of them. He kept his eyes on the platform, on the woman standing at its center, who had not so much as flinched at the new voice entering the bidding, as though she'd long since stopped letting herself hope any particular outcome might be better than another. He understood, watching her hold that same flat composure through his own bid. That hope was a thing she had decided, at some point in the last 3 days, she could no longer afford, and something about that understanding made him angrier than anything Stone had said from the platform. Stone's smile flickered just once before he caught it. He had not expected competition from a rancher in a plain wool coat, and he liked competition, because competition meant a higher number. And so he pushed back with a counter that should have ended it. Beau raised again and again. The other bidders in the yard, the ones who had been there for sport as much as purchase, dropped out one by one as the number climbed past anything sensible for a season's fence wire and salt, until it was only Beau and Stone's smile had gone thin and calculating instead of easy, doing the arithmetic on what this rancher's pride was worth to him, and deciding it was worth quite a lot. When Beau finally named a figure that emptied most of what he had in the world, savings meant for a new well, money set aside against a bad winter, the whole careful cushion he'd built over 3 lean years, Stone's mouth opened to counter again, then closed. He looked at Beau's face and saw something there that told him this young rancher would keep going past sense, past reason, past anything Stone could match without losing money on the transaction himself. And Stone was, above everything, a man who protected his margins. He spread his hands, called the sale, and named his price. Beau paid it in full, in coin and a note the banker in town would honor, and Stone's man brought him the paper, the bill that named her as property changing hands, signed and stamped and legal in every territory that recognized such things. Beau looked down at it a long moment. Then he looked up at Shima, who was watching him now for the first time since the bidding started, watching him with an expression that gave away nothing at all, braced for whatever came next, because nothing good ever had. He tore the paper, not carefully, straight down the middle, and then again, the halves falling to the dirt at his boots, while the whole yard went silent enough to hear a wagon wheel creak 2 streets over. "You owe me nothing." His voice came out rougher than he meant it to, and it cleared his throat and said it again, steadier. "Not coin, not work, not company, not one single thing. That paper's trash now. You're free to walk out of this yard and never look back, and nobody here is going to stop you." He glanced once at Stone, a warning plain in it, then back to her. "That includes him." Shima stared at him. Around them, the crowd had gone from silent to murmuring, men working out what they just watched, whether it made this rancher a fool or something else they didn't have a word for yet. She did not move for a long moment, searching his face for the trick in it, because in her experience, kindness offered in public by a stranger usually had a hook buried somewhere inside it. She found no hook. She found instead a young man standing in the dirt of an auction yard with his savings gone and his hands slightly unsteady, looking almost as unsettled by what he'd just done as she was. "That paper you tore?" Her voice came out low, controlled, the accent of her first language shaping the English carefully. "Does it change anything? It changes everything, or it changes nothing. If you decide it should." Beau met her eyes. "That part's yours. To decide, not mine." She looked at him another long moment. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the yard, past the rail, past the murmuring men, past Stone standing with his fists closed around nothing, and did not look back once. Beau watched her go until she turned a corner and was gone from sight, and then he collected his fence wire and his salt and his new hinges, because a man still had to run a ranch even after the strangest morning of his life, and rode home alone with an empty feeling in his chest he could not entirely name. He did not see her again that day nor that evening, and told himself that was the right and proper end of it, that he'd done what conscience demanded, and the rest was hers to make of as she pleased, that a woman with her pride and her losses did not need a stranger's ranch to feel beholden to. He fed his stock and mended the dragging hinge, and ate a poor supper alone, and went to bed with the particular tiredness of a man who has spent every spare dollar he owns on a decision he still could not fully explain to himself. Before first light, something woke him, not a sound exactly, more a wrongness in the quiet, the kind of alertness a man develops living alone on open land. He pulled on his boots and stepped onto the porch with his rifle in the crook of his arm, and there in the gray not quite dawn, standing at his gate with her hands folded in front of her and her chin still level, was Shima. She did not explain herself. She did not apologize for the hour, or ask permission, or offer any account of where she'd spent the night or how she'd found his gate in the dark. She simply stood there, waiting, as though standing at a stranger's gate before sunrise required no justification at all if the reason was sound enough in her own mind. Beau lowered the rifle. "You didn't have to come." His voice was thick with sleep and surprise both. "I know." She held his gaze steady. "I am not here because I owe you a debt. I came because I chose to come, and there is a difference, and I would ask that you understand it before I set 1 foot past this gate." He studied her face in the thin light and found nothing in it but plain truth, and something in him relaxed that he hadn't known was tensed. "Then come in. There's coffee, such as it is, and more work than one man can rightly manage." She was inside the gate and passed him toward the barn before he'd finished the sentence, already assessing the place with a quick, practical eye. The sagging rail on the east paddock, the water trough that needed scrubbing, the woodpile down to nothing. The eye of someone who had run a household and could not stand to see one running poorly. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Neither of them had planned, and neither quite knew how to name. Shima worked from first light without waiting to be told what needed doing. Mending fence, hauling water, working the garden plot gone to weeds behind the house with a patience Beau's own hands had never managed. Beau, for his part, refused outright to give her orders. Some stubborn instinct in him insisting that a woman who had just walked free of an auction platform would not be told what to do in his house or on his land. Not by him, not by anyone, not ever again if he had any say in it. It made for an awkward, careful kind of partnership at first. She would finish a task and stand waiting, unused to a household where no one directed the next chore. And he would catch himself starting to suggest something and stop, and they circled each other's habits for the better part of a week before either found any comfort in it. The house itself gave her trouble those first days, in ways she did not say plainly, but that Beau noticed regardless. She slept, he discovered on the second morning, not on the pallet he'd made up for her in the small back room, but on the floor nearest the door, a habit that told him plainly enough what 3 days bound to Stone's fireside had taught her about doors and who controlled them. He said nothing about it directly, only began leaving the door to that room unlatched and the bar off the front door entirely, a small, wordless proof that she was free to come and go by her own will at any hour, and after 4 or 5 nights he noticed the pallet had begun to see use instead of the bare floor. She was careful, too, in ways that took him longer to notice, about food, taking modest portions even when he pushed the plate closer, watching first to see how much he took before deciding how much she would allow herself. Old habits from a childhood that had likely known hunger even before Stone's rope ever touched her wrists. He started without remark, cooking larger portions than one man alone would ever eat, leaving the extra plain on the stove where she could take more without it being a thing either of them had to discuss. And slowly, over that first careful week, he watched her stop measuring herself against his portions. There was an afternoon in that same first week when he came in from the west pasture to find her sitting at the kitchen table with his spare shirt spread in front of her, mending a tear along a seam he'd been meaning to fix for 2 months, and never got around to her, stitches small and even and far neater than his own clumsy attempts. He stood in the doorway a moment just watching her work, struck by how natural she looked in his kitchen, in his light, bent over a task with the same total focus she brought to everything. And it was in that unremarkable moment, more than the auction yard or the gate at dawn, that he first let himself wonder whether this arrangement might become something neither of them had planned for it to become. "You are staring." She did not look up from the needle. Didn't mean to. He came the rest of the way into the kitchen, embarrassed at being caught. "Just wasn't expecting to find my shirt looking better than when I bought it. Your stitching is an insult to the shirt." There it was again, that almost smile. Quicker to surface now than it had been that first week. "I could not let it continue suffering under your care." He laughed and took the seat across from her, and they sat together a while, in a silence that had stopped needing to be filled with anything at all. Watching him hesitate one evening over whether to ask her to help move a feed sack, she'd finally had enough of it. "You keep stopping yourself. Say the thing. I am not made of glass." Didn't want you thinking this was the same as that yard. His ears had gone red at being caught out. Somebody telling you what to do. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but close to its shadow. There is a difference between a man giving an order and 2 people working the same land toward the same end. I have not confused the two, since the first morning. You may stop treading so carefully." He laughed, short and surprised, and after that, the careful circling eased into something more like ease. It was Shima, in fact, who first noticed the old wound Beau carried, the one he rarely mentioned and never complained of, a puckered scar low on his left side that pulled tight and pained him on the coldest mornings. She caught him favoring it one frosty dawn, one hand pressed briefly to his ribs, while he thought no one was watching, and asked him plainly what had happened, in a tone that made clear she expected an honest answer rather than the deflection most men offered about old injuries. "Fell wrong off a green horse, the second year I had this place, landed on a fence post." He shrugged it off. "Doctor in town stitched it up crooked, and it's ached in cold weather ever since. Nothing worth troubling over." She did not accept that answer as final. She went to the small store of dried herbs she'd begun keeping in a corner of the kitchen, plants she'd gathered on her walks along the fence line, roots and leaves Beau did not recognize, but had stopped questioning after the first week, and made a poultice she pressed warm against his side that evening. Her hands sure and unhurried the way they were with every task she undertook. It was not medicine he'd ever have thought to ask for, and he sat still and let her work in a silence that had become by then comfortable rather than strained. She wrapped the poultice snug with a strip of clean cloth. "My grandmother taught healing before she taught anything else. A wound left to itself only ever teaches a body to expect pain as its natural state. Better to tend it properly even years after than to simply learn to live around it. It sounds like more than fence posts and old scars." He watched her face. "It is," she agreed, and did not elaborate further that evening, though something in the careful, deliberate way she finished the wrap told him the words applied to more of her own history than his. He let it lie the way he'd let so many things lie in those early weeks, trusting that whatever she was willing to share would come in its own time, at her own pace, without him ever once demanding it of her. The ache in his side troubled him less after that, whether from the poultice itself or simply from the fact that someone besides himself had finally tended to it, and it became, over the following weeks, a quiet ritual between them, her checking on the old wound some evenings without being asked, both of them understanding by then that the tending was as much about the two of them learning to care for each other as it was about any scar. She told him, in pieces over the following days, about her grandmother, about a winter camp scattered by soldiers who came through with orders that made no room for the people already living on that ground, about a name, Shima, that her grandmother had given her, and that meant, in the old tongue, something close to the son's mother, the one who gives warmth without needing anything back. He told her about his own mother, about the uncle's spread he'd inherited half wild and half in debt, about nights he sat up doing arithmetic that never quite balanced, and wondered if he'd taken on more than any one man could carry alone. Neither of them named what was growing between them, because neither trusted themselves yet to be right about it, but it showed in small ways in how she began leaving his coffee exactly as strong as he liked it without being asked, in how he began finding reasons to work the fence line nearest wherever she'd chosen to work that morning. Then in the particular quality of the quiet between them at supper, which had stopped being awkward somewhere in the second week and become something closer to comfortable, there was a morning 10 days or so into that new rhythm when a late-season storm rolled down off the mountains faster than either of them had judged it would, and they spent an hour together in driving rain, getting the last of the herd into the near pasture before lightning found the ridge line. Beau went down hard in the mud chasing a stray heifer that had bolted for the tree line, and came up laughing despite himself, rain running off his hat brim and sheets, and found Shima laughing too, a real laugh, unguarded, the first he'd heard out of her since the gate before she caught herself and pressed her mouth flat again. As though laughter were another thing she'd decided, back in those 3 days with Stone, she could not afford. He didn't call attention to it. He only offered his hand to pull her across the last stretch of mud to the barn, and she took it without hesitation, and something about the ordinary warmth of her palm against his stayed with him longer than it had any right to. Other days were quieter and taught him things about her in smaller measures. She showed him, one afternoon, how to read the particular color of sky that meant an early frost was coming, knowledge her grandmother had given her the way his own mother had once tried to teach him to read. Weather from the ache in an old dog's hip, and he realized, somewhere in the telling, that he was listening to her the way he'd once listened to family. Not out of obligation, but because he wanted the knowledge to stay with him. She in turn began asking him things about the wider territory where the rail line ran, which towns held which kind of law, how far a person on foot might get toward the northern foothills in a hard week's walking. Questions she asked lightly, almost carelessly, but that he understood carried more weight than her tone let on. He answered everyone honestly, and never once asked why she wanted to know, because he had promised himself, that first gray morning at the gate, that he would never again be a man who made her explain herself. She caught him one evening, standing at the edge of the north pasture, staring off toward the foothills himself, and asked what troubled him. "Nothing troubles me, not quite true. Just thinking on the arithmetic. Man spends most everything he owns on a single decision. He ought to lie awake some nights wondering if he'd do it again. Would you every time, no thought needed at all, which surprised him more than the question had. Wouldn't change $1 of it." She studied him in the fading light a moment, the same careful measuring look, and said nothing more that evening. But the quiet between them on the walk back to the house had a different weight to it than the quiet of the first week, less like two strangers circling, and more like two people who had already decided something about each other. Even if neither had said it plainly, yet there was one trip into town during that second week that tested the fragile new rhythm more than either of them expected. Beau needed to settle an account at the mercantile, and rather than leave her alone at the ranch for the better part of a day, he asked, carefully, whether she'd care to ride in with him. She considered it a long moment. He could see her weighing the risk of being seen again in the same town that had watched her stand on Stone's platform, weighing whether the whispers that would surely follow were worth the trip, before she agreed on the condition that she would not wait outside any building-like property left tied to a rail. The town had not forgotten the auction, of course. Heads turned when Beau's wagon rolled down the main street with Shima seated beside him rather than behind or below, and the mercantile owner's wife went visibly stiff behind her counter, unsure how to price goods for a customer she still, in her own mind, half considered someone else's belonging. Beau handled it the only way he knew how, plainly, without apology, introducing her by name to anyone who addressed him directly, and letting his tone make clear that any question about her presence would be answered the same way twice. Shima, for her part, matched his composure with her own, meeting every curious stare levelly until it dropped away, refusing the crowd the satisfaction of watching her shrink the way she had refused Stone's crowd weeks before. It was Sarah Whitfield, wife of the rancher 2 spreads over, who broke the town's collective hesitation, crossing the street deliberately to introduce herself and ask Shima, woman to woman, about the beadwork pattern on the small pouch she carried at her belt, a genuine question, curious rather than pitying, and the first one anyone in that town had put to Shima since her arrival, that treated her as a person worth conversing with, rather than a spectacle worth discussing. Shima answered carefully at first, then more easily as the conversation continued, and Beau, watching from a few steps off while he loaded the wagon, felt something in his chest loosen that he had not realized was still clenched tight since the moment they'd rolled into town. Not every soul in this territory is like Stone, Sarah told Beau quietly before they parted, her eyes flicking once toward Shima. Some of us have been waiting a good while for a man to prove it out loud instead of just thinking it privately. You did right by her in that yard. Don't let anybody in this town make either of you feel otherwise. It was a small exchange over almost as soon as it began, but it stayed with both of them the whole ride home. Proof, however partial, that the world outside the ranch gate might eventually hold room for what they were building, even if it took the whole territory longer than either of them to come around to it fully. It was into this fragile new rhythm that Jeremiah Stone rode back 3 weeks on, with 2 hired men flanking him and an ugly look on his face that had nothing easy left in it. He'd had time to think about the money he'd lost that day, about the humiliation of a rancher tearing his paper in front of half the town, about the story that had spread through every saloon and mercantile counter within riding distance, the story of the fool who paid a fortune for a woman's freedom and gave her away for nothing. Pride, in a man like Stone, did not heal on its own. It festered, and it demanded repayment, and he had convinced himself over 3 weeks of drinking on the matter that the law would side with him if he pushed the question hard enough, that a torn paper and a dusty yard proved less than his memory of the sale itself. He had spent those 3 weeks moving from town to town along the same circuit he always worked, and everywhere he went the story of the auction yard had arrived first, told and retold until it had grown well past the plain facts of it, and every version made him smaller. In one telling, he'd been laughed clean out of the territory. In another, the rancher had struck him in front of the whole crowd, which had not happened, but which Stone found himself unable to correct without drawing more attention to the humiliation itself. He drank more than usual those 3 weeks, and the drinking did what drinking always did to a man already inclined toward grievance, sharpened the insult instead of dulling it, until by the time he turned his horse back toward Beau Calder's ranch, he had convinced himself this was not vengeance at all, only the simple collection of a debt owed, the kind of righteous correction any reasonable man in his position would pursue. He brought 2 hired men, rather than riding alone, not from any particular plan beyond the vague sense that a show of numbers might settle the matter without requiring him to test his own nerve directly against a man who'd already proven, in that auction yard, more stubborn than his plain wool coat suggested. The 2 he chose were drifters he'd used before for rough work, men who asked few questions so long as the pay was steady, and neither of them had any particular stake in the outcome beyond the day's wage Stone had promised for an afternoon's simple work, which was as Stone described it to them on the ride out. Nothing more complicated than reminding a rancher and his property what the law actually said. That paper doesn't hold up. His voice carried from beyond the gate, his 2 men fanning wide on either side of him, hands loose near their belts. I know men in this territory who'll say the sale stood regardless what you did with the copy. I'm here to collect what's mine. Beau stepped off the porch with his rifle already in hand, feeling something cold and clear settle into him that he did not entirely recognize as his own usual temperament. Nothing here belongs to you, Stone, not then, not now. She'll say different once she remembers who fed her the last 5 years. Shima stepped out beside Beau, a hoe still in her hand from the garden row she'd been working, her voice flat and hard as flint. I did not eat at your table by choice. I remember exactly whose hand held the rope. You will not stand in this yard and rewrite what you did to me. Stone's jaw worked, and whatever calculation he'd been running through in his head, bluff, threat, some middle road that let him leave with something, collapsed into simple ugliness. He gestured his 2 men forward, and they came through the gate with the particular confidence of men used to taking what they wanted from people with no one to stand behind them. They found this time that there was someone to stand behind her. Beau put himself between Shima and the nearest of the 2 hired men before the man had gone 3 steps, and the fight that followed was fast and ragged, and without any of the choreography of a fair one. Fists and a thrown lantern and a scramble in the dirt of the yard Beau had built with his own hands. Shima did not retreat to the porch to watch it happen to her a second time. She swung the hoe handle hard into the second man's ribs when he came around the wagon to flank Beau from behind, and the crack of it dropped him to one knee, and she stood over him with the hoe raised and her whole body coiled and ready, daring him to rise. Stone, seeing his hired men going down, one after the other against a rancher and a woman he'd been certain would fold at the first show of force, made the calculation men like him always eventually make and put his own survival ahead of his pride. He backed toward his horse, calling something about lawyers and territorial courts that even he did not sound like he believed anymore, and rode out with his 2 men limping behind him, and did not come back that day, or any day after. In the quiet after, Beau sat down hard on the porch step, one eye already swelling, his knuckles split and bleeding, and looked up to find Shima standing over him with the hoe still gripped tight in both hands, breathing hard, her braid come fully loose now and hanging wild around her shoulders. "You're hurt. You hit a man half senseless with a garden hoe." He almost laughed despite the pain of it. "Might be the finest thing I've seen in my whole life." She set the hoe down at last and knelt in front of him to look at his eye, her hands gentler now than the last 20 minutes would have suggested possible, and something passed between them in that close quiet, his split knuckles, her steady hands, the whole ugly morning finally behind them. She cleaned the split over his eyebrow with the same careful, unhurried hands she'd used on the fence rail and the garden rose, and he sat still and let her, watching her face while she worked the way she'd once watched his hands, while he cleaned a wound of her own, weeks back, on this same porch. Neither of them spoke of what had almost happened, of what Stone's men would have done to her had Beau not put himself in the gap, or what might have happened to Beau had she not swung that hoe handle with everything her 3 days of bound wrists and swallowed fear had built up in her. They did not need to speak of it. It sat between them plainly enough in the quiet, in the careful way she taped the last of the bandage down, in the way his hand came up to briefly cover hers before she could pull it back. "I thought, watching you go down first against that man, that I would lose you before I had decided what you were to me." Her hands stilled on the bandage tape. "That frightened me more than Stone himself ever has. Didn't plan on going down, man, surprised me." A rueful half smile. "Wasn't planning on much of anything today, except mending that east rail. You never plan on the things that matter most. I have noticed this about you. You did not plan to bid on me either. You simply did, because something in you would not let the moment pass." He had no answer for that, only the sense that she'd named something true about him that he had not yet named himself, and he let the silence hold it rather than reach for words that would only diminish it. That night, with Stone's threat hanging unresolved somewhere out past the gate and both of them nursing bruises by lamplight, Shima told him she had a choice standing in front of her, now that she had not let herself think about clearly until this exact evening. There were still people of her band scattered in the foothills to the north, a scout she trusted who could get word to them, a possibility of finding what remained of her family and rebuilding some version of the life the army sweep had broken apart. She could ride north come morning. Nothing bound her here. Beau had made certain of that himself, with his own hands tearing a paper in a dusty yard 3 weeks back. I know. It cost him something. To say it plainly, and he meant every word of it. You don't owe me a season of your life because I did the only decent thing available to me that morning. If north is where your people are, then north is where you should ride, and I'll saddle the horse myself and not say one word to slow you down." She looked at him a long moment in the lamplight, the same measuring look she'd given him in the auction yard weeks before, searching his face for the hook that had never once been there. "I have thought of the foothills every night since I came to your gate. I will think of them still tomorrow and the day after. But I did not walk to your gate that first morning because I had nowhere else to go, Beau Calder. I have had nowhere else to go 100 times in my life, and I did not go looking for a stranger's porch on any of those nights. I came to yours because some part of me already knew, standing in that yard while you tore the paper, that a man does not do such a thing for a stranger unless something in him already recognized something in her worth doing it for." She paused, gathering the rest of it the way she gathered herbs along the fence line, careful and deliberate, taking only what she meant to use. "I have turned this over more nights than you know, lying on that pallet by the door you never bar. North is my grandmother's country, or what is left of it, and some part of me will always belong to those mountains, no matter where my feet finally settle. But belonging to a place and building a life in it are not always the same choice, and I have watched you these 3 weeks build something here worth belonging to as well. Not a ranch only, but a way of treating a person that I did not believe still existed in this territory until you tore that paper in front of a crowd who expected you to keep it. That's a lot of weight to put on one torn paper, no argument in it, only wonder. It was never only the paper, it was everything after it. The unlatched door, the larger plate you never once mentioned, filling. The questions about the northern road, you answered honestly, instead of trying to talk me out of asking them. A man reveals himself in the small hours more than the large ones. Beau Calder, and you have revealed yourself to me 100 small times since that first gate, and every one of them proved the same true thing. And now? His voice had gone rough again, the way it had in the auction yard, the way it seemed only when what he was saying mattered more than he had words ready for. Now I am telling you I choose to stay, not from debt. Not because I have nowhere better. I choose this gate and this ranch and this rhythm we have built these 3 weeks because I want it, and because for the first time since the soldiers came through my grandmother's camp, wanting a thing feels like it is allowed to me again. He reached for her hand, then slow enough that she could have pulled away if she'd meant to, and she did not pull away. There's something I should ask you. You've been Shima to me since the first morning at the gate, and I never once found out if that was the whole truth of your name or just the piece you were willing to hand a stranger. She turned her hand over in his, palm to palm, and held it there a moment. Shima is the whole truth of it. My grandmother gave it to me herself, and I have given it to no one else since the day the soldiers scattered us, not to stone, not to any man on that platform who demanded my name like it was theirs to take. I gave it to you that first morning because some part of me had already decided before I understood it myself that you are not a man who would use it against me. May I keep using it then? Not because I have any claim to it. He wanted the permission plainly given, the way she'd asked it of him at the gate. Something in her face came fully open for the first time since the auction yard. All the careful guardedness of 3 weeks finally set down. You may use it every morning for the rest of however many mornings you'll have me standing at this gate. By the time the sun came fully up over the ranch the next day, the frost silvering the fence rails and the whole valley waking slow and gold around them, Shima stood beside Beau at that same gate, not as a woman with nowhere else to go, but as a woman who had weighed every road open to her, north to the foothills, or forward into a life neither of them had planned, but both of them now wanted, and chosen this one, freely, with her own name, spoken out loud between them at last. Audibet moved through the territory the way word of anything unusual does, faster than anyone particularly wanted, and by the time the leaves turned that year, most everyone within 2 days' ride knew the story of the rancher who tore up a bill of sale and the Apache woman who came back to his gate anyway, not because the debt demanded it, but because she was the one who decided it should be so. Some called it foolishness. A few, the ones who had actually watched Shima swing that hoe handle into Stone's hired man, called it something closer to justice finally landing where it belonged. Beau never much cared which word people settled on. He had his ranch and his ledger somewhat lighter than it used to be, and a woman beside him every morning who had chosen to be there of her own free will and reminded him of it in her own quiet way most days since. If this story has held you this long, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member. It helps us keep finding stories like Shima and Beau's. There is a particular kind of story that keeps finding its way back to us, one where the debt everyone expects turns out to be the smallest part of the truth, and the real story is what a person chooses once nobody is holding anything over them anymore. Shima chose a gait and a rhythm and a name spoken freely after months of silence, and Beau chose to ask permission for something he could have simply assumed was his. Somewhere between an auction yard and a frost-silvered morning, two people built a partnership on nothing sturdier than honesty, and the plain willingness to let the other person choose, and it held better than any paper ever could have. Stone rode out of the territory before the following spring. His name worth less in every town along that road than it had been the season before, and nobody troubled themselves much over where he went. Some things, once a person builds them out of nothing but cruelty and other people's desperation, simply cannot survive contact with a story like the one Beau and Shima built instead, out of a torn bill of sale and a woman's own free choosing. The scout Shima had once thought to ride north to reach, came instead to her, riding 2 days south when word finally traveled up through the foothills that a woman matching her description had settled at a rancher's spread rather than vanishing the way so many taken, in those years, simply vanished, never accounted for, never found. He arrived at the gate one morning in early winter, cautious and armed, and Shima walked out to meet him with Beau, a careful few steps behind, giving her whatever space the conversation required. She spoke with the scout a long while in her own tongue, words Beau did not understand and did not try to, standing back and simply watching her face move through things he recognized, even without the language, grief, relief, a kind of homesickness that had nowhere left to go, because the home itself no longer stood the way she remembered it. When the scout rode off again that afternoon, carrying word back to what remained of her scattered band that Shima had been found and was, by her own telling, exactly where she wished to be, she stood at the gate a long while, watching the empty road north, before she came back inside. Beau did not ask what had been said. He only put coffee in front of her, and let her decide, in her own time, what of it she wanted to share, and that evening, she told him most of it anyway, that her grandmother had not survived the sweep, that 2 cousins had made it to a reservation agency 200 miles distant, that the scout had offered, more than once during their talk, to guide her north himself, if that was still what she wanted. And what did you tell him, though Beau thought he already knew? That I had already chosen my road, and that he was welcome to visit it whenever the distance allowed, but that I would not be riding back with him. He did not understand it entirely. Many of my people would not. But he did not argue it either, because he could see, I think, that it was a true choice and not a trapped one. They married the following summer, a small gathering at the ranch with that same scout riding the 2 days south again to stand witness, along with a handful of neighboring ranch families who had come to know Shima over the intervening months, as the woman who could read a coming frost before the almanac, and who had once, according to a story that only grew taller in the telling, put a grown man on his knees in Beau Calder's front yard with nothing but a garden hoe. Shima wore, under a plain dress, no fancier than any other rancher's wife might choose, a single small feather worked into her braid that had traveled with her since the auction yard, the one thing Stone's men had never thought to take, because they never thought it worth anything at all. Beau thought it was worth everything and told her so, and she only smiled the way she'd learned to smile in the months since that first cold morning, freely, without having to measure first whether it was safe. In the years that followed, the ranch grew the way ranches do under 2 sets of capable hands. Instead of one, a second well dug the following spring. The herd built back past what it had been before Beau spent his savings on a decision he never once regretted, a proper garden where the weed patch behind the house used to sit. Planted and tended in rows, Shima laid out herself. Some crops he recognized, and some she had to teach him the names of. Neighbors who had once whispered about the fool rancher and his purchased Apache woman came, in time, to simply know them as the Calders, and if a few old-timers still passed around the story of the torn paper in the auction yard over cards at the mercantile, they passed it now, the way people repeat a story they're proud to have witnessed even second-hand. Not as gossip, but as something closer to legend. Sarah Whitfield became, over those years, something close to a true friend, the 2 women trading seed and cuttings across the fence line that split their 2 spreads, and it was Sarah who stood beside Shima the day their first child was born, a daughter Shima named in both tongues, one name for the territory's records. That carried her grandmother's memory forward the way her grandmother had once carried her own mother's. Beau learned that second name, too, in time, and used it as carefully, and as rarely as Shima used it herself, understanding by then exactly what it meant to be trusted with a name a person did not hand out freely. He kept folded in the same drawer where he'd once kept the note for the bank, the two torn halves of that old bill of sale, retrieved quietly from the auction yard dirt the week after the sale itself, not as any claim on her, but as a reminder to himself of the morning he'd nearly let a moment of hesitation cost him the truest decision of his life. He showed it to her, only once years later, and she looked at the torn paper a long moment before folding it back into his hand. "Keep it, if it means something to you." She folded his hand shut around the torn paper. "I stopped needing reminding of what I chose the morning I chose it. If you have not already, like this video and subscribe so the next story finds you. We will see you at the next gate and the next ending worth staying for."